don't like to question people's motives. You know, I think in some respects I see this as not a horrible thing, in the sense that it shows that there's people out there who are opening up their Bibles, and I hate to say it, their Strong's Concordance, and they're trying to figure out what is the original biblical calendar. So on the one hand, they acknowledge, okay, the Hillel 2 calendar, that wasn't the original calendar. That's clearly something invented in 359 AD, and before that there was something different. And so I want to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're truly searching and doing the best they can.
Let me say there's something else here, that goes on. If the Jews do it, it's got to be wrong, so we're going to figure out another way. I see that a lot, Nehemia.
And there's definitely an element of that.
Okay. So as long as you admit that there's something like that going on.
When you're talking about the lunar Sabbath, for example, which maybe we'll get to, I think that's the predominant factor.
We'll jump in anytime you want to.
Okay, but I do want to talk about, and we'll talk more hopefully in a future episode about Colossians 2:16. And when we get to that, I want to talk about how there's all these different calendars. I don't want to bash the people who have all these calendars, even though they're wrong. But really, I want to give them the credit that at least they're trying, because if they didn't try, then they'd just be following the Hillel 2 calendar. So at least they're making an effort. And some of them really in innocence. I've talked to people who do things like, I remember years ago, there was this guy who had a full moon calendar. And he was convinced, based on his reading of this verse in Psalms, Tiku b'chodesh shafar b'kesar liyom chagenu, blow the shofar on the new moon, on the kesar for the day of our feast. He was convinced that the full moon is the new moon, which, in Hebrew, it's like, there's no way you could get that. But he was convinced of this. And one of his arguments is that the full moon is just so much easier to see, and God doesn't hide the truth. It's hard to see the new moon. So I said to him, I wrote to him, I said, you know what? I said, let's try this calendar out. And I was completely, in all sincerity, saying, I'll go up onto the hilltop to observe this full moon of yours in Jerusalem. This guy was in some place in rural America. I said, I'll go up on the hilltop on my free time to observe this full moon, which you say is so easy to observe. What exactly am I looking for? So he explained, it's the first full moon to rise after sunset. So I went up to the hilltop in Jerusalem, and it was not easy to sight at all. How do I know if it's risen after sunset or before sunset if there's clouds on the horizon? Right? I see a full moon when it's right over my head, but can I really tell the difference? By the way, I can calculate the moment of full moon. That's using computers and advanced calculations. If I'm observing something like ancient people did, how would I know that the full moon is going to be on Tuesday night or Wednesday night? It's not so straightforward.
Well, let me say this.
Yeah.
The first sliver of the new moon, sometimes it's 1% illuminated.
Yeah.
What is 1% away from 100%? It's 99% illuminated.
Okay.
Can you tell the difference between 98 and 99% illumination? Because that full moon is just a moment in time anyway.
Right, and there are many months when the full moon takes place, that moment in time, when the moon isn't above the horizon in Israel.
Exactly.
So one night you look and it's 99%, and the next night you look and it's again 99% because you missed it. It was dark.
Right.
It wasn't that time that the moon was above the horizon. So I said to him, I want to see how to do this. So I went up to the hilltop, and I remember it was during the time when it was the Second Intifada, and I was on this hilltop, and I could see the muzzle flashes in Ramallah, less than 10 miles away, and hear the shooting going back and forth of the battles going on there. And I'm trying to look for the new moon as these Apache helicopter gunships are going overhead. And I'm like, this is surreal. I'm looking for the moon to rise just after sunset. And it wasn't so straightforward to sight. And the point was, here's a man who in all innocence had come up with this system which made perfect sense to him based on his Strong's Concordance and his English translations, and he had a theory of how it worked, but he'd never actually tried to put it into practice in the land of Israel. And when I tried to put it into practice, I wrote back to him. I said, you might be right. I don't see evidence for you being right, but anything's possible. But this isn't, you can't be right because it's an easier system, because it's not. It's a complicated, your system is extremely complicated as well. So, there's an example of someone who I think really was innocent. He just came up with a theory and knew he was right, but when he tested it, it didn't work.